One question I'd like to put to the panel, and Petros, you have had some discussions with me about this in the past. NAFTA, okay? NAFTA comes out, and Trump administration says it's the worst deal ever, trade deal ever, right? Have to get rid of it. So what do? After a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric, we end up with an adjustment to some of the parameters within NAFTA. I won't go into all the details about that. They put a time limit on it, so it now has a period when we have to look at it again, and then an end date, technically. But basically, the structure has been retained. Structure's been retained. So what's all the hullabaloo about? And why all the chaos? And it seems to me some of those improvements could have been made with far less chaos in the system. What's the view of the panel on this? Anybody?
Damien made the point on this before. You made the only positive point you saw about the negotiation of NAFTA, and then I'll give you an anecdote about NAFTA.
With respect to NAFTA, I'd just like to quote the editorial from the Financial Times 2 days ago. One of the, that was not the editorial, it's one of the opinions. And the title of this opinion was, "Trump is cheap." And I think that's essentially the insight from the NAFTA deal, is that there was lots of talk, and then in the end, a deal which is not so different from the original NAFTA agreement. Of course, there are some differences that we should not possibly neglect. I think the most significant from my perspective is probably the fact that the agreement is no time barred. I mean, that there was a time limit on the agreement. There is this sort of interesting clause such that, the US has now asked Canada to ask its permission, essentially, to negotiate a free trade deal with China, which is a bit odd because it's really making a free trade agreement contingent on negotiating or not negotiating a free trade agreement with respect to someone else. So that's novel. But when you look at the other provisions, I think that they are relatively marginal changes with respect to the original NAFTA agreement. So I think that's one of the reasons as to why the Commission, the European Commission, is fairly cool about the whole thing, because they might think that they might get away at the end of the day with just a treatable victory for the president. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's right. I agree with that very much. I think that one of the more difficult areas of negotiation was around the domestic content requirements now, which have been raised and which will affect the supply chain. And I am not clear whether even companies feel that's in their interest to have seen those adjustments and what it will do in terms of altering investment patterns. I think that's something to really watch. The other features, there are new provisions on the digital economy. They are based off of TPP language. They do seem to go a bit further. There is this both 6-year sunset and then third party. Those are interesting features. But the Canada dairy has seen some adjustments. So you can point to things, but your starting premise, I agree with. The pain involved in getting there has been very high.
Yes, I agree.
The reputational consequences, the sense of, these are our allies,
Yes.
This is where planes land when they can't come to the United States.
Exactly.
So, there are some real concerns about whether the price, or maybe both Mexico and Canada have taken a very measured response. We've gotten to an agreement. Maybe we go forward in a positive way.
That's what you said, yeah.
I'll add just one thing. Which is minor, but it's quite indicative of the attitude. I was at a conference at NYU, investment protection in NAFTA, and I realized that the US, for the first time, introduced in NAFTA a clause whereby if I'm an American exporter and I have investment in Mexico, I cannot go to a tribunal. I have to, what you call in law, exhaust local remedies, which means American investors have to first go to the Mexican courts. Right. Spend I don't know how much time. And I saw one study. I asked the person who hosted the event, and the estimation was something like 6.5 years to go through 2 instances in Mexico, average. And I wonder, I said, I mean, this guy, did he ever speak to the predecessors who were discussing the same issue with the European Union in TTIP, which fares much, much better, lengthwise at least, when it comes to this type of cases. And they said, this is too long for us. We need to have an international court. International court when the dispute takes something like 2.5 years, and no international court when it takes 6.5. I mean.
One other question before we turn to the audience here. We haven't talked about TPP except briefly here. And that's sort of been trashed by everybody. I mean, Hillary threw it out, and Trump has said he wasn't for it. But realistically, that would put the United States in a much better position vis-a-vis China. So it seems to me now, if we were to even work our way back into it, we'd be in a much worse position if we had stuck with it in the first place. What's the panel's view of TPP and what we ought to do? Where are we on that? Is that still have value to go after?
It has a new name. It's like USMACA, comprehensive TPP now.
Okay. However you want to describe it.
I'll tell you one sentence on this, then we pass it on. I mean, to me, quite frankly, this is the most hard to understand choice of this administration. TPP is negotiated without China, about China. You speak to, we had a couple of conferences at Columbia Law School a few years ago, SIPA, not Law School, no, where's Jeff Sachs? SIPA, no? SIPA, about this issue, and it's clear that everybody was thinking about China. Said this is our moment of glory. We can do a deal which China has to either buy or not buy. Without China, I repeat. This is why you have a huge chapter, 100 pages almost, about state-owned enterprises, which you see en passant 2 or 3 times in the protocol of accession of China. So much for foresight by the European and the American negotiators in the 90s. Now, you have this deal, which would be quite a constraint on China because of the, it's not a complete contract, but it's important disciplines against state-owned enterprises, and the US walks out.
Crazy, right. Any other thoughts on where we are?
I think one thing to bear in mind about this is that it's not just about the economics, that there's another agenda that's going on that is very anti-global. So, it's fine for me to talk about the costs on the economy, and we tend to talk about what's good for companies, what's good for workers. But there's another agenda here, which is, trying to reduce immigration, trying to reduce internationalization. And I think it's an aesthetic agenda that's not necessarily being motivated by, doing standard economics. And I think that it's important to realize that component of it. And that's why, to some extent, when I stand up and I give these arguments about costs and benefits and all of this, I don't think it's really convincing to many people on the other side, because I think what they're looking for is something very different. They've got a different view of how the world should be structured. And so I think within that context, TPP is just, it's too international. We're going our own way. We're going an America first approach.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add to it is, when TPP was being negotiated, I thought there were some parts of it that I was not in favor of, even as an internationalist. But once it had been agreed to, you have to look at it in its totality and say, are we better with it or without it? And I concluded that I thought we were better with it, partly because I thought it was a signal to China, not to contain China, but it was a signal to China that this is where the architecture is going. And at a time in China's own evolution of its economy, where it had not liberalized the service sector very much, and it was recognizing that it was time for more opening in that direction. And many people in China were talking about this, that TPP was moving in that same direction. Now, the state-owned enterprise provisions, or the provisions around state-owned enterprises, would be very hard for China to do. So But there were many features that directionally were, I think, nudging China in that same direction. Afterwards, it falls apart, but TPP 11 goes forward in a very interesting way with considerable Japanese leadership. So it's not gone, but the dynamic in the region has changed dramatically.
And we're less influential as a result.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line.